Today is a very special day. We got Taylor Arnold and Lauren Tilton, who are professors for data science and linguistics, respectively, and digital humanities at the University of Richmond, Virginia. Great place. And they are ready to give us an intro into distant viewing, their theory of distant viewing. There is also a book. And anybody who is in the area of cultural data analytics, or more broadly speaking, digital humanities, or even multidisciplinary science, knows that macroscopes, where we don't look at specific things only, but where we zoom out, like in the same way that we zoom out when we look at the atmosphere of Jupiter to see patterns, is sort of a thing that we do now, including in the humanities. So this is a very, very, very important topic. And so we're very much looking forward to your comprehensive theory of it. The sort of rules of the game of the CUDAN Open Lab seminar is we have a 2-hour time slot. And the idea is to do it in a way that sort of maximizes discussion. So typically we have 40 minutes talk, 80-minute discussion. But of course, you can use the whole 2 hours. You can take questions in between. You could take questions afterward. So basically, you can do whatever you want with the 2 hours. And the idea is basically to have a format which makes it worthwhile for us to hang out together, even on Zoom, where people get a benefit from being here as opposed to watching the thing on YouTube later on, which let's greet that audience too. One of the second to last one before Christmas, we had 350 views in 2 weeks. So we consider you a very, very important part of our audience. And it's a great pleasure for us to sort of like produce content that sort of is worthwhile for people to see. With that, I will give the stage to Taylor and Lauren, and you can just share screen and take it away from here.
Yeah, great. Yeah. Well, thanks y'all for including us in this. It's very exciting to be a part of this. And it was Amila who, right? Amila who reached out to us initially. So thanks to her. Thanks for that. And then, so we'll start a little bit on what is distant viewing a bit. Oh, there's Mila to say thank you. We'll start a little bit about what is distant viewing as a theory and a method. And I guess we'll stop there for a minute, see if there's some questions. And then we'll kind of go into an example of using it with a FSA, some photography. And then I guess we'll pause a little bit there. And we can talk a little bit about how we've been using it more broadly with some cultural heritage institutions, such as the United States Library of Congress, which we've been working on it with here. So we'll try to pause a little bit in between and try to monitor questions as we go and address them along the way. And we'll try to make it as maybe hopefully as interactive as one can, given the format. So there's Mila. Thank you, by the way. I was going to say hi. So thanks for including us. We've been having wonderful conversations. So thanks for reaching out as well. So excited to be here. So let me share our screen and we'll tell you a little bit about our positionality and jump in. Let's see. Maybe that's actually the best way to do it. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Does that look okay for y'all? Okay, excellent. Let me get the chat box.
Usually it pops out.
Okay, cool. So distant viewing. So you want to start a little bit about our lab? Oh, okay, so we're here at the University of Richmond. We run what's called the Distant Viewing Lab. So what we really are thinking about is how to use and develop computational techniques to analyze visual culture on a large scale. And what we think about is developing tools and methods and data sets, as well as more traditional books and research papers and those pieces. And it's a part of, I'm sure for this group, not a surprising, but it's a part of an effort, at least in the US context, in the humanities, to expand what counts as scholarship and to expand more interdisciplinary work about data, software, and those elements, and bring it together with work from statistics and data science as well. So if that's an interesting conversation, always happy to have that one along the way. So that's what our lab does. And what we do is really try to bring two kind of main areas together. One is my area of visual culture studies. I'm trained in American studies with a focus on US visual culture in like film and television, and DH as well. And then Taylor.
Yeah, and I'm trained in statistics with the focus on working with text and image data.
So we try to bring those together, as well as we have a colleague in our lab, a postdoc, and several students and others who work on this, trying to bring these kind of intersections together in a fun way, and we think in a pretty fun way. So a little bit about, so one of our main pieces here then is what we're calling distant viewing. And this will be a book coming out with MIT in the fall. So a bit of a sneak preview of some of the pieces that are coming out in that work in this upcoming fall. And it will be open access as well. So just as a nice part for that, we really believe in that. So one of the reasons we came to this work was thinking about how to use computer vision with visual culture. And so one of the main challenges is, sorry, there is a dog in the background. Apologies in advance that there might be a few barks along the way. One of the challenges is that this question of what is this an image of? And so how computers see images is a series of pixels and basically basically a series of numbers. And so one of the things is, how do you even tell the computer what those pixels put together are? What is this an image of? Becomes a really core problem of issues. So, so when the computer looks at the computer, when a computer looks at photos, it tries to basically unscramble what that image looks like based on all the pixels in there. And part of the challenge then becomes telling the computer vision algorithms exactly what those series of pixels are doing. So is this a photo or an image of bikes? Is it an image of a camera taking a photo? Is it an image of leisure? Is it an image of trees? Is it an image of indoors? Is it an image of outdoors? Is it an image of people? And all of a sudden, we have all these questions about how do we answer the question, what is this an image of? And that becomes really key to part of the theory of distant viewing, which was working to theorize exactly how computers see digital images. And this challenge is what we're talking about. So we have this theory that what we're calling distant viewing.
Yeah, so the idea really came from my background is working with text and image data. We started thinking about like, how do we, from a methodological standpoint, how do we really work with images? And realize that it's quite different from text, because with text, you can, at least as a starting point, split the text into words, count words, build things like TF, IDF, or topic models, or you can always work with the words as kind of the first source of meaning. But with images, there's really no equivalent way of splitting the image into pixels. There's no kind of given way of doing it by word boundaries and identifying linguistic constructs in the same way. So we thought about every time we were working with images, it felt a bit ad hoc, and we wanted to actually have a theory about like, what does it really mean to do computational analysis with computer vision? And so that's where we came up with the idea of distant viewing, which is a theory and method for the computational exploration of images through the application of computer vision. And in order to understand what that means and the implications of it, we started to think about computer vision as being a computational mode of communication. So it's a way of taking the image, which is a form of information and a message, and actually converting it into another format. And often the other format is one in which we can actually do computational analysis on. But the way that we do that, unlike something like splitting a piece of text into words, there's no right way, there's no kind of first pass that works well on everything. You really do have to decide what features you want to view and what things you want to annotate in the image by deciding which algorithms you're going to take from computer vision and how you're going to use them. Because we're really replacing the physical human act of viewing and interpreting the image with a computational process. And so that's how we get this idea of distant viewing. It's not just applying things at scale. It's the idea that we are really engaging in what we call viewing, this turning the pixels into annotations, at a distance in a computational way where we're not manually going through and tagging them, which would be great. And people have done really great work of manually tagging images, but there's a problem with scale there. And so we wanted to work with collections which exceed our ability to look at every image or keep everything in our memory about what we've seen, and also to be able to explore like really rich annotations that would be just too time consuming to do them on hundreds of thousands or millions of images.
So one way to think about this is that we encode ways of seeing through computer vision to then try to decode the meaning of images or the messages of images as well, drawing on theorists such as like Stuart Hall. And so also as a part of that, then the way that we apply computer vision is not outside of any cultural, social, and historical ways of seeing and practices of looking. I'm sure for this audience, that's less of a big statement, but if you're staying within more CS communities, thinking of computer vision as a way of seeing and therefore inculcated in social and political and cultural ways of seeing is a more point of contestation as one, particularly in that way. So we then have turned this into a method as well, thinking about it into sort of 4 major parts.
Yeah, and so this comes from, so I'll actually show this slide as we walk through it. And so the idea is that there's this kind of standard idea of this data science pipeline of what do we do with structured data which are just perhaps many, but tables with lots of rows and columns. And that we usually start by taking the data, organizing it or tidying it, and then exploring it with models and visualizations and transformations, and then communicating our results. It's never that simple, and you're often kind of going back and forth, and you explore the data and realize that there's a problem, and you have to go back and collect more, and so on and so forth. But that's kind of the general way that we teach data science now. And there are tools, the tools that are built in data science kind of are associated with each of those steps. So the idea that we were thinking about, that we've been working with, is that with distant viewing, with the idea of working with computer images, that we really have to slide this extra step of annotation into the data, that we can't just start by organizing and collecting and tidying our data. That we really have to take the visual data and annotate it. And that's a very intentional and important step where there's not a right thing to do. And one really has to think about what algorithms to use, how to apply them, what kind of pre-processing to do to the images before you pre-process them. If it's moving images, do you do it to every frame? Do you do it to every other frame? Do you split it into shots first? There's a lot of information you have to do before you can actually get to the organization and exploration of the data set. And so we really just described the distant viewing method as having these 4 parts. We have to first annotate the data, and that's the one that's really quite different from working with other structured data. And then we can organize it, explore it, and communicate it. And then at that point, at least we can use a lot of the tools of classic data science, but it's not exactly always the same, primarily because you always want to have to, because you've lost something, and in the way that you've encoded the information with the computer vision algorithms, you always have to go back constantly back to the original images as you're doing things. You can do a plot and you can see a point that kind of doesn't sit into the rest of them, and then you go back and look at them. And so it actually becomes even more iterative and more kind of going back and forth between kind of this like hermeneutic cycle of looking at the data at scale and then going back to individual images and then going back to the data at scale and then going and kind of really understanding the data and the collection you're working with as you work back and forth between looking at individual images and the data at scale and aggregated and organized that way.
Yeah.
And when we get to an application, you'll see that we constantly go back and forth between like plots of the data at scale and then individual images, and that's really how we gain our understanding.
And so part of what we've done then is turn this into a toolkit as well. So we've taken part of that stage, the annotate stage, and are turning it into a toolkit. This is also with support from the Mellon Foundation here. And you can do these annotations such as face detection, object detection, shot, scene breaks, other kinds of image detection of types. And then you have an output, and then you can explore the data in something, say R, Python, or
yeah. And so the idea was that sometimes people hear toolkit and think it's kind of like you put your data in and it comes out with a paper almost written or something like ChatGPT style. But all it really does is you put in the images, and then you decide which computer vision algorithms you want to use, and you can change the tuning of them. And then it produces data that you then start, like a traditional data science pipeline, you put that into R or Python and analyze it and explore it and visualize and do all of that. So it doesn't do the analysis for you. It really tries to lower the boundary so that people that have skills to work with structured data can also work with visual data, which we think that there's a lot of really fascinating visual data, but that a lot of researchers get I guess like turned off from them because there's so much you have to learn in terms of setting up a pipeline to work with computer vision, and we are trying to really reduce the entry requirements of that.
Yeah, and so with the new grant, where actually it'll be more like a kind of GUI interaction, so you can think more of it kind of like Voyant style for image analysis as opposed to like on the command line. So that's what we're working on right now for that, and then you can explore the data and do that. So before we go into an example, I thought we'd stop for a second and see if there's like questions. And I mean, some of this might come together more as we talk about an exact example of how we did this and what we did. But I just want to pause for a minute in case there's.
So if anybody wants to ask a question, just raise your hand. You can also do this in between, even though they don't do a break. We won't break, but we can see that you have a question. Or put it in the chat if you like. So yes, Mila has a question.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I'm just a huge fan of your work, so I can't hold myself. Yeah. No, but I think it's I kind of like really love the way you have come together with this distant viewing framework and such. But one of the things that I'm kind of like pondering myself, because I'm, as you know, to give you some background, I'm cultural historian, and I'm currently working with some newsreel data. So I have both Soviet newsreels and Estonian newsreels that I'm analyzing, and I have this project going on, and as you showed your pipeline, you have this annotation is kind of like one of the crucial steps when starting to look at the images, and that's kind of like a little bit problematic to me as a cultural historian, because my interest in this data is not to try to see some particular, I don't know, Lenin heads there, or annotate all the heads of Lenin or something else there, but just to kind of like get an overall picture of what kinds of visuals they were kind of like showing in the newsreel. So kind of like I have been just playing around with this idea of postponing this annotation or kind of like analyzing the meaning of the images at a later phase of this. So that's why I'm kind of like, I see that this annotation is meaningful in many ways, but I have been just trying to think about the ways to how to look at the images first as a kind of like numerical features in a way, and then I don't know, I maybe kind of like putting myself in a very complicated way or messy way, but just maybe my question is that, have you been thinking of putting this kind of like place where you do annotation or actually the interpretation, what is seen in the images at the later phase in your pipeline? Thanks.
Yeah, no, that's a really great point. And I think it gets at the real challenge of working with images. So I will say, when we say annotate, we probably should have explained it more. What we really mean is that it's not necessarily manually annotating something and then building an algorithm. Like there are examples, like you said, like finding Lenin or finding a particular symbol or flag or something and then finding it across the corpus. But we mean using a computer vision algorithm to take the pixels and create structured data from them. So it wouldn't necessarily need to mean creating your own algorithm. It could be taking an algorithm that already exists and is able to detect 1,000 different kinds of objects, and you apply it to your corpus, and then it detects all those different objects, and then you can take them and tabulate them and see which kinds of objects appear a lot in your corpus, and then make some decisions about what thematic things are going on in that collection, and then going back perhaps, oh, maybe you notice there are a lot of cars, and then you could build a more specific algorithm to detect certain kinds of Soviet cars and go back and forth and do something like that. So that's really what we meant by annotate. It doesn't mean manually annotate or even know exactly what you want to look at. For us, a lot of our annotations, we are often interested in the way that people are being framed within the image, and we'll talk about that in our application. And we don't start with the idea of let's identify a portrait and just tag a portrait as this, but we detect all of the body parts in the image and all of the faces and all of the way the faces are oriented, and all of the like different elements of clothing. And so we detect all of those and we just get this mountain of structured data, and then we start to analyze it to figure out what patterns we see. But I do agree. I mean, that is kind of the challenge, and that's to me why we came up with distant viewing essentially, is because with text you don't have to do this. That's why you can split into words, count the words, and you kind of delay the interpretation till later. And although you can do it in a very general way, and hopefully a way that allows for free exploration later, you do have to make some decisions about what you want to look at before you start analyzing them, because just the raw pixel intensities they don't really have a lot of meaning on their own. But yeah, there are strategies to be more to do it in a more general way.
Cuomo has another question.
Yes. Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Good. Hey, I'm curious about the pipeline. I mean, now that you explain a bit about the annotation and how you approach it, like in the way that you would take some body of data and then you would apply some algorithms to it. So then I started thinking about your pipeline. So what's the role of evaluation, and is that somehow incorporated into the distant viewing framework? Because I mean, if you don't evaluate, if you don't have any kind of manually annotated data, then how can you be sure of the performance of some algorithms? Because you then quite strongly rely on those presumed good results. You get my point?
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah. I mean, in the annotation stage, we do plenty of evaluation to check. We meant more like building a custom, like algorithm, go finding something particular, but we do. We'll do things like just like check the results against a set. So
one of the things, and I think that's a great point that we always think about, is how to evaluate them. And so actually that's one of the draws to me of the distant viewing toolkit is, so the first one is that every single annotation has a visualization element attached to it. So if you have something like an object detector or a face detector or a pose detector, it has a way of producing a visualization of what that thing detected on top of the image. And we'll actually show at the end of our presentation today a visualization engine that we created called ADDI that lets you do this at scale without actually having to run the images yourself, just so you can see how the algorithm works. But the other thing was, so it's nice because we always do that. And when we work on a new set, we actually create maybe 100 of these from each annotator and look at them all and make sure that they all work. And sometimes they don't. Sometimes we find some algorithms are very sensitive to the input material. Some are very generic. And then the other one is that we have one of the problems with computer vision right now, to me, is there are so many different algorithms out there and so many different GitHub repositories, and it's not really clear like which ones work really well and which ones are very specific to some application, or just they just like don't generalize very well outside the set. And so one of the big things we've done with the toolkit is meticulously tested a lot of these on very different kinds of data, more cultural heritage data, older digitized records, film reels from the 1900s or early 1900s, and so while you still should definitely check it on your own data, we think the algorithms we've picked are a bit more robust to working with cultural heritage data, even though people rarely test it on that kind of information.
So this is a interesting kind of application case where you try to make it easier for humanists by pre-selecting a bunch of algorithms, which is sort of, one could say there's a genre of tool, like GFI does this for networks, NodeGoat does it for particular social networks and stuff like that, which obviously sort of creates sometimes a little gap of where you have people buying into that, adopting that, but then they don't have to read up on, you know, how to run a pose recognition algorithm in a Jupyter notebook, which is also not that hard. So the question is, do you think you are, like, who do you think, whose work do you think you facilitate, and whose work do you think perhaps make it a little harder maybe for a computer science professor trying to teach plain pose recognition in Jupyter notebooks to humanists? I don't know. It's like, did you think about that, or?
I mean, I think one of the things we were thinking about is, like, and at least in our context, like undergraduate education, where you have like digital humanities, or you have media studies and media literacy, where people can use these tools for that kind of like initial ramp on to see what's happening with to get kind of in the ghost in the machine, kind of what's inside, how are these things making decisions. The other was to think about, I think one of the things that, I mean, at least a lot of people think about, whether you're humanities or a social scientist, is, does that method, does like text analysis or image analysis or sound, audio, like, is that going to do the sort of work I need it to do for the questions I'm interested in? And I think that's also what we were thinking about as an audience who's just like, I want to dabble with some image analysis, see if it can even do the kinds of things does it produce the kinds of evidence I'm interested in to answer the questions I'm interested in? And then you kind of know, okay, yes, okay, let me go dive deeper into this now. It's kind of like Voyant, I think, for many of us who've used that, we're like, okay, text analysis is interesting. Actually, this is really cool. Let me go learn R. You know, so I think there's a little bit of that too, as the sort of intermediate space between for folks as well. And then cultural heritage institutions, about pipelines for that.
So you basically want to produce some gravity assist towards doing it sort of like in a more, you know, sort of base manner, basically, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
okay.
Exactly. Yeah.
So Mark Hunnett has another question, the upper half of Mark Hunnett, I can see. Hi, Mark. I think you're muted. No? Hello? You're not muted, but we cannot hear you. Maybe until this works out, you mentioned the hermeneutic circle, which is an interesting thing, because in your pipeline, there is no feedback, but the hermeneutic circle provides you exactly that. Like, how do you see that? It is a little bit an extension of Mila's question. Like, how do you see that feedback of annotation and analysis, basically? Is that something which you think is systematic, or are the applications you imagine more like a one-shot thing? You do your annotation stuff and then like you do analysis, but you don't go back and sort of iterate over it.
Yeah, no. So, and that's why. So the toolkit is really just that first step of the annotation. And so at that point, then you have structured data, and then you can iterate on the structured data by constantly going back to the original, because in the output CSV, you'd have a link to the image, so you can sort all of the images by the number of faces, and then look at the one with the most faces, or you can find the image has the most color blue, and then look for that. And so a lot of the iteration comes after the annotation, but you can of course create new algorithms and then reapply them or apply them with different tuning parameters, but they're not built into the toolkit. That part really comes after the toolkit creates the structured data for you to look at.
Nice. Mark, can we try again? We can still not hear you. Now you're muted though, so we can.
Yes, now I think. Sorry. Very interesting talk. I was thinking, how you in your method when you have already annotated large visual material? I think for me it was not clear if you annotate images or also like audiovisual material. But how you visualize when you have a lot of annotated already material, like for example, thousands and millions of frames or images?
We've run this over. We've done like whole sitcom series for like 10 years. So, at the frame rate of, we run this over large scale, we'll do face recognition. And then this is probably getting to your question slightly, like what we'll do if, for example, is like do face, like where's the face on the frame? And then we'll sort of delay what that means to then like shot type, like close up, long shot, medium shot. And then we'll turn that into something we analyze. So it's not that you're not initially looking for shot type, you're looking for faces. So we build analytically like the layers of what those annotations mean at once we start seeing patterns or knowing what ideas it might map onto. And then we can scale that. So it's not that we say, go find close-ups. We say, go find faces. And then now look at where's the face in the shot. And now we map, and if it's certain parameters, we then map it onto the idea of a close shot. And then we say, how many close shots are there in the film? So it's like the building of the layers off those, and the annotation layers, like a building layers that are built off of the computer vision images. We will say that like the idea of how computer vision works doesn't just have to be like photos. It could be film or newspapers, as long as it's an image file, like a JPEG. It's composed of pixels, basically. But does that help answer your question, Laura?
I think no. More my point was actually we do in the lab working in a tool for representation of large visual material, but we don't do the part of analysis that you are doing. And my question is if you also doing the part of visualization.
Visualization, not in the toolkit.
No, not in the toolkit. We do a lot of visualization of the structured annotations. We don't do, and then for there we just use like pretty standard data science tools like R and Python. We haven't done a lot of what's that Yale one?
Pixplot.
Pixplot, yeah, where you're really trying to visualize a large set of images as images. There's a lot of great work for that, and that was one of the reasons that we like creating the structured data that anyone can ingest. And Pixplot, there's a tool that will visualize, I think, about 20 or 30,000 images in a browser, and we actually have created data that can be ingested by that.
Okay, no, I'm just actually introducing because we might maybe show you our tool, because we are able to some 100K images on a browser.
Oh, cool.
Oh, cool. Awesome.
Yes. So one thing which I think sort of before it gets lost between the line, which I think is really interesting, is what you just described is if you say, oh, you look at several seasons of TV series at frame rate, and then you do this sort of meta recognition. One thing that you do is coarse graining. And so this is a really interesting thing, which I found quite fascinating in the last couple of months. I realized that not all, particularly in humanities, people are not all familiar by this concept, which is sort of very, it's a main concept in complexity science, right? You have starlings in the sky, and every starling has rules and behaves according to, and then you see the swarm doing things. So you have an equality, there's a cloud over here, there's a cloud over here, and they merge and so on. So if you do this kind of thing where you sort of recognize faces, you see how they sit in the frame, going to 20,000 is not a large number. It's a small number with respect to the millions of frames you have from several seasons of the TV series. And I think that is a really interesting thing, that if you're kind of, that kind of analysis sort of like does this, because let's be very frank, like if we do classic film studies or classic art history of tuna paintings, if you look at the 89 paintings of Caravaggio plus minus, and there's 14 winged figures in there, you're not going to encounter that problem. Right? So it's like something you can easily depict on a double page spread. And so that is a really interesting thing. And so I think it's very important to emphasize, and it's also important to emphasize that this is not a thing that can be solved with a tool like, oh, let's do a visualization thing. But there's all this process before. In that sense, if I understand this right, this is sort of like your main focus, that sort of like pre-processing stage. But I think what would be really great, even though I love discussion, is if we will continue with the introduction, because what for me is not so clear is what it all entails. Like, why should I use this and not awk or Python or R or whatever?
Well, yeah, well, I think we'll jump into an example of some of the work we did, an example of the FSA, and then we can talk about maybe for others, a Toolkit might be helpful. But if you're comfortable in Python, you might just roll on. So we'll go back here. Okay, cool. Y'all all good?
Yes.
Okay, great. So we'll show you a little bit example of what we have done with the method when we've done some distant viewing with a collection from the FSA. So a little bit about the FSA. So in the 1930s, the US federal government undertook passed the New Deal, a series of legislation that was in support of new government agencies to help resolve or reform and support amid the Great Depression. One of the big units was called the Farm Security Administration, and it was charged with helping and supporting farmers and agricultural workers who had been whose land was no longer feasible to use for agriculture, and looked at how to support people as well. And at the same time, the New Deal was coming under scrutiny for being a sort of overextension of federal power, and a lot of it was sort of being contested. So one of the ways, a photography unit called the what's colloquially known as the FSA unit was started to try to create photographs that documented the reason for the needs for the federal government to intervene during the Great Depression, as well as show the success of the federal agency there. So they produced some of the most iconic photographs of the 20th century in the US. One on the left is Dorothea Lange's, on the left is Walker Evans in Hale County, Alabama. In the middle is Dorothea Lange's migrant mother, and on the right is Rothstein's in Arkansas. And these sort of three photographs, people sort of studied the same 10, 20, 30 photographs and studied the same photographers over and over again, such as Walker Evans on the left and Dorothea Lange. And in that process, has sort of come up with an image of the region of this kind of important photography unit as really about the American South and the Dust Bowl in the US, so a certain regional configuration. Yet what was going on was a lot of photographs were actually going to Washington that got put in filing cabinets. So what you see on the bottom is actually people taking the photographic prints, taping them to cardboard and putting the captions on the bottom of them. For current archivists, this is what you would not do this, but it was this was kind of the early advent of photo archiving. And so what happened is, so this unit, which had some of the most had some of those iconic images of the era, is, again, as I said, it's often understood as about this really particular region, the American South, and the Dust Bowl, which is the southern US, kind of around North Texas, sort of central south of this nation. It also been understood as sort of the unit's been sort of understood as a kind of technocratic and bureaucratic propaganda that produced progress narratives for the government. So people have seen it, scholars have written about it as sort of the photographers being just sort of tools of the state, like, well, they're going to go out and just show the need for government, the government's needs, and particularly to support particular policies, in other words, propaganda. But we were interested in how might we be able to study these images and the metadata with our knowledge of the archival evidence, how might we be able to study it in a different way using distant viewing? And we followed the organizer of the collection. So the person who found it, who was in charge of this unit, was named Roy Stryker. And he had said, the work we did can be appreciated only when the collection is considered as a whole, and the total volume is staggering and has a richness and distinction that simply cannot be drawn from the individual pictures themselves. So about 170,000 photographs went back to Washington, D.C., and about 70,000 were printed on these little cards you see. And you can see behind him the stacks of cardboard with the photos on them that are waiting to be filed in that filing cabinet behind him. So we got interested in that whole, what happens when you look at the whole. So I just want to make sure that everyone's clear about the kind of historical context to this. Are there any questions about that before we keep going?
Thank you very much. I find it makes me smile. In the 1990s, I spent about 50% of my income on the development of 35mm slides. So the number of 170,000 photographs that are of which 70,000 are printed on paper. I'd like to appreciate everybody to appreciate how much money that was.
Yes.
The amazing thing. Thank you very much.
Yeah, it was no small investment. So we decided we'd take a look at the whole. So what happens when we move away from the same 5, 10, 30, 40 photographs, but kind of scale up? So this is where we decided we draw on the sort of idea of distant viewing. So the first was just thinking about how do we annotate these images? What kind of algorithms do we want to take an initial look with? And this is the idea of needing to annotate the images prior to working with them computationally. And so one that we've worked with was what's called an image segmentation algorithm. So this is one where it has two sort of classifications. One is objects and one is stuff. So objects are things that you can count, like the dog or the horse and the person and windows or things like that. The other is stuff, which is sort of classified into two different ways of thinking about it. It's kind of indoor and human made versus outdoor and quote natural environment. And they're kind of broken down into different categories from there. So there's like kind of a hierarchy there. So you get things like sky and grass, or you might get like wall, brick, or wall, like plaster. So it kind of like breaks down into multiple, like, so indoors, wall, wood, or something like that.
And the impetus for computer scientists building these kinds of algorithms is that the initial focus was so heavily on detecting objects. And then I think actually talking to some people in visual culture studies, and they were noticing that actually very little of the frame proportionally is taken up by those objects. And really there's all this foreground and background and just what they said, amorphous stuff in the back. And so they wanted to actually build algorithms that would detect the entire image, not just detecting the objects. And so that's where this came from.
And I like this because this kind of gets again at Mila's question. It kind of is semantically one layer less specific. So it gives us a little bit more room to work with. So thinking of indoor, outdoor, or grass, environment, people, for like historians of photography, this is interesting to think about how this might map onto concepts such as portraiture, studio photography, environmental photography, right? These sort of larger concepts. So it's not that we're going looking for those immediate concepts. We're using some of the elements of the annotations to build up to some sort of area that we might be interested in. So this sort of gets a little bit more, yeah. And
it's also nice because it doesn't reduce. I think there's this idea that annotation, it removes information and changes it, but actually the size of the annotation is bigger than the image itself. You now have, I think it's 107 numbers for each pixel. So actually the amount of data on a raw count is higher, but it's structured in a way that we can aggregate and work with it.
So we decided to use this one for this, and we just began to look at the different elements of the photographs. So we ran this over all the photographs in the collection, and then we just began to look at the counts of all the tags and manually inspect the results on a small sample. So this comes back to that validation checking and looking at this. I'll note that in some collections too, which you were asking about validation, you do have the benefit sometimes of others like cultural heritage institutions also archiving and giving subject headings to photos as well. And we've used things like Library of Congress subject headings. We've used other archival keywords to check our work as well for validation. So we've actually harnessed the metadata of the our cultural institutions who do the amazing work to do these collections as well. So you got to see some groups like ground and dirt and building and bridge. And this becomes an interesting way to think about what kind of photographs are taken, what are the themes in the collection across it, and then to what degree, since this is supposed to be really about environment, how much of them are outdoors and how much of them are really focused on the land and the environment, which was supposed to be the sort of primary goal of this particular government agency, to focus on farming and agriculture. So we did some validation. If you want to talk about that.
Yeah. So we applied the segmentation algorithm to each image, and then we created, and this is the exploratory kind of piece, 6 different tags that summarize the data in different ways. And we got this by, again, like looking at the images, going back and forth between looking at like the image, the visualization we just showed, and then the actual image, and then doing this for weeks on end, actually, and just understanding what the data did and coming up with these 6 tags. And the idea is that it's not that we had to go back and re-annotate or go back to the toolkit, but these are things which are, we took the output of the toolkit and then created tags on top of those. And so we created 6 tags that summarize the data. And so every image is marked whether or not it has this or not. So it's marked with people if at least 1 pixel on the image has person, outdoor if at least 10% of the image comes from outdoor categories, and then building, sky, ground, plants, and ground. Again, these are the second order level categories. We marked it as those having those elements if at least 10% of the image had those elements. So then once we had those tags, we went and looked manually at 125 images that had the tag and 125 images that did not have the tag. And then we put them in a folder or actually put them on a website so it's easy to scroll through them and manually tag them. And then you can see that we get the vast majority of them correct. I think the lowest was plants with or ground with about 90% correct, all the way up to people, which it's very accurate about, with a classification of 96.4. And almost all of the people ones are where there was a person way in the background and it just didn't see it, rather than a person that it didn't know. So.
Yeah. So then what we did was we combined it with the metadata. So, and this was a bit, we do these things a bit iterative, like you say, so we'll go back and do, kind of iterative process. So what's one benefit for this is that this collection is very well documented relative to many photography collections. So there's a photographer, date created, medium, title. And so we were able to then combine it with all the metadata that was about the image for that as well. And then we just started to think about themes. So you were asking about themes, like how do we scale up? So we just started to use these categories to look at things like, to what degree are they outside and what degree are there people? You want to jump on that?
Yeah, so here we took each of the photographers and looked at all of their images and then built these little confidence intervals to detect the proportion of images that had people in them on the x-axis and the proportion of their images that were taken outside. And then we labeled all the photographers. There are also, I think it's 4 that we had that cross over. So the collection really is known often, sometimes FSA and sometimes FSA-OWI. So it was actually in 3 technically, but it does have this real split that while originally was the collection or the unit was supporting the New Deal, as the US entered into World War II, it became much more of a war propaganda machine. And so we split the photographers who were involved in both parts of them into their FSA years and their OWI years to see the pattern across the collection. And you see there's a really very strong signal here with Walker Evans taking lots of photographs outside and very few people, and Esther Bubbly taking almost all of the photographs with people and only less than a third of them being outside. And so you really see this shift in the collection that matches the changing goals of the archive.
And this aligns well with the scholarship, which is a nice, kind of a focus on the outdoors and the land as it shifts toward more of the interior and sort of the war effort. So that is aligns pretty well, which is a nice check as well on our work. But then we can also begin to explore themes. And one of the things I got really interested in was, if you look at Collins, Bubbly, and Parks, was starting to look at some of their work in there, and you start to see that the movement inside actually isn't just about, well, one of the things is that it's just about World War II and the war machine, but you start to look at these interior spaces, and you actually start to see that certain photographers had a real, didn't just focus on the war, but they actually got into sort of intimate spaces that other photographers couldn't. So Gordon Parks was the only Black photographer as a part of the FSA, and then Bubbly is one of the few women involved. And so when you start to look a little bit closer as they go indoors, it's not just that they're actually going to take photographs of war and mechanization, industrialization, but actually they're able to get into spaces that others aren't. And so you start to see this sort of visual intimacy of their work that other photographers don't quite have, which I think is really interesting. So it's not just the distance, but the distance lets us see the sort of pattern, and then to like look again back at the individual photographers to zoom in and sort of see their work in relation in a different way, and sort of speaks to the power of the positionality of the photographer and how they were able to capture parts of life in DC amid segregation, both segregation along race, but also the way that women were relegated to certain spaces as well in the DC area. So we start to see the sort of ways that gender and race are playing out by looking at this relationship between outdoor to indoor as well. I saw, was there a question, or are we good? Or? Oh, I think you're silenced.
I said I did raise my hand.
Yeah.
I think what you just said actually added to the question, even indeed. You said in a side sentence, this aligns well with the scholarship, which obviously, you know, we all know this feeling you show something quantitative or distant. Yeah. And then some qualitative specialist says like, but we all know this. And so the same is true for these kind of things. You could say, okay, it's a no-brainer that certain people have access to certain spaces when they're photographers. And naturally, in this particular action in the FSA, there is different people who were photographers in the same way as New Deal artists included African-American artists drawing different sujets and stuff like that. But for that case, one interesting thing that I find very striking is that not only do you find these no-brainer things, but you find things that you wouldn't expect, right? Like African-American artists painting white people, and in configurations and themes that you would not know, because typically qualitative questions are sort of theory driven, and then you search for that and you find that. Well, if you look distant, you find things that nobody has ever thought about. And so my very straightforward question that would be, you know, yeah, there's stuff scholarship aligns with. What kind of stuff do you find, and can you systematically do so that people did not expect?
Well, I guess we'll go a little bit into that in a second, but I think part of it, what we start to see is the sort of geographical expanse of the collection is shifted. So it's not just the South, but it actually is like national. So it's a national scope of the project that I think also becomes a part of the equation, that as opposed to this real deep regionalism that only kind of pictures the American South and Dust Bowl as the center of poverty. And then, yeah, do you want to?
Yeah, and then I think the other one is that, like, when we were looking at this image, the thing that really aligns with scholarship is the fact that the dark squares are on one side and the white squares are on the other side. But what was striking to us was not that all of the FSA ones are all on top of each other and all the OWI are on top of each other, but there is really this very strong individual photographic style of each photographer, and really a noticeable difference about what they were taking photographs of.
Another thing that was interesting is, like, if you look at the center here, someone like John Delano and John Vachon in the middle, or Vachon, and Lee. One of the arguments is that the unit goes to war and everyone just like goes and takes photos of industrialization and of militarization, and like because it really shifts leadership under the OWI. And which is like Vashon and Lee and them actually don't change that much. And when you go back and look at their photos, like Vashon doesn't like, he's like, isn't following the rules. He's like, ain't having it. So he's just like still going around rural Southwest, Midwest. Like he's like gonna keep driving, and like Delano too is not having it, and Lee is not having it. So like they're just like staff photographers from the World War II, from the Depression period. They go into World War II and they are just basically left funded to do what they want, while the others have like we don't have on here Palmer, but others are just like all their photos just become like, you know, military planes, retooling, scrap metal, all the things, all the sort of tropes of, I mean, World War II. If you think of the like stereotypical images from the US, that like it probably came out of the FSA, the OWI. So I think that's interesting too, is that these photographers, they were like, still got funded, and they were like, nope, ain't having it. See you later. So I don't know if that's a helpful one, but like, they were like, thanks for paying. We'll see you on the flip side. Like,
nice. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and then you can.
Yeah, and again, it connects ideas like state power and stuff like that. So, okay, so another thing we did, as we said, we could just sort of cross the themes, is that the photographers are broadly focused on the outside, as it maps onto it, to sort of get general idea of it being focused on the land and agriculture, with the shift to the OWI, when the nation ramps up industrial. But we can start to see these kind of ways that other people are kind of making space in other ways. So one of the things we became really interested in was like photographer style. So like, to what degree are they, how much are they having a lot of space over how they frame their work, or what kind of styles are they producing as they do this? So one of the things we got really interested in is the way that you could use the ground and the sky to think about vantage point and the angle of a photo, right? So how is a person photo? If we think about someone photographing over someone that has like power over them versus looking up to them. And so the ways that the visual kind of rhetoric of imagery works. So we started to think about the way that the sky and ground become a way to see how the photo is composed, photographs composed.
Yeah, and so for that, we took the other 6 tags and did the same plot where we looked at the percentage of photographs from each of these photographers that contain the sky, the ground, plants, and yeah, and the sky, plant, ground, yeah. And so when we do these plots, we see that a lot of the photographers kind of cluster around a pretty generic style of including both of them, but that there are some outliers or very unique styles of certain photographers. And we had not thought of these before, but then when we went back into the collection, it was so obvious. And it was kind of to your point that like, once you saw it, it seemed obvious, but we'd never heard anyone talk about this before. And although we had looked at these photographs for years, had never noticed it as a pattern either. It's only once you know it's a pattern that it becomes obvious. So for example, what do you want to talk about, the ones on the right?
Yeah, sure. Oh, you want to do Bubbly? Yeah. So one of the ones that I got interested in was Esther Bubbly again, and how much her photos are how much more less ground she has, and how much like she's looking up toward the sky. And it made me kind of see her photos in a different way, which was realizing that a lot of her photos involved her looking like up to her subject. So if like Walker Evans tends to be like what's called straight photography, like dead on, like almost at eye level with photographers, which has a sort of evening effect, like almost has like a straight gaze. Bubbly is always seems to be pointing her camera up to her subjects. So it's really interesting to see the sort of like kind of, you could see that sort of a time of like reverence for her subjects, and also her like kind of often her photographs focused on like sort of the monumentality of Washington, D.C., sort of like looking up to the state, looking up to who she was photographing, and seeing that as really as a different style than someone like Walker Evans, who was known for the sort of flat, straight photos. And so starting to see these sort of ways that different photographers are looking and seeing their folks trying to see that as a way that elements of their composition can shift as a part of their own style and as a part of their images.
So that is something, if it's systematic, probably has to do also with the way people use the camera, right? Like obviously if you have a mid-format camera and you're used to carry it below your head and you look into it, then obviously you have to tilt it up to meet sort of the subject. What I was quite surprised looking at that plot is that how systematically all the other stuff is sort of in the middle, which is quite interesting. We have this paper in PNAS about dissecting landscape paintings, where the first cut is sort of typically what we call the dominant horizon, like sort of that's not land sky, but it's more the sort of the strongest transition in color between land and sky. It may also be sort of like between yellow and blue in the sky, right? But one of the interesting things is there seems to be a systematic evolution of that over centuries. And then in the 20th century, there seems to be alignment across all the isms. And this is very much the realm in which this happens. It's typically unimodal. So there's a kind of between a third and 50% where the horizon is, where there is sort of the peak, and then sort of everything is of course possible. But that is a really, really interesting thing, that this is sort of like, it seems to be not something that people very consciously do, but it's really something which, and I hate to say that word, that is sort of zeitgeist in a sense, right? Where there is a kind of way of doing things. And obviously with cameras, which come with a lot of affordances, like a 35mm camera, you have to hold like this, a Leica, you have to hold like this, a mid-format camera. If you want to do this like in eye level, like good luck, right? I mean, you have to have a little chair with you, whatever. So that is a really interesting thing of like, what are these affordances, I think. Yeah, thank you very much. This is great.
Thanks. Yeah, so this is just a little bit closer. That's how that sky, the ground sky, how that's sort of giving you a little closer look at how it helps you see the way you can start to see the angle of the photo and what it's picking up on. And I don't think when people design this for ground skies is what they were thinking of, but you know, we've been thinking, so this is where like, you know, kind of layering it onto the concepts that drive at least the stuff we're interested in, like visual culture as well. Another one was just using the objects to sort of see the breadth of the collection. And this is sort of a thing where we were talking about kind of, you can use some of these object detectors to just see things as thematic.
And this is a good example of what we were talking about with Mila, where you can apply this algorithm and just finds all of the objects that's in its lexicon. And then we can look at them and see these themes that we didn't necessarily know existed.
Yeah. And this is sometimes, you know, we see things here like bicycles and leisure and birthdays and parties, and you can see that kind of mapping onto terms in here like, so
the first two rows here are different images that detected the object cake, for example, which was really neat because we saw these different cakes often in the US, you know, used as birthday parties. I think 3 or 4 of these are at least birthday parties. And so you see this really interesting Cutodian view of the US through different foodways, and all these photographs were taken by different people in different places at different points in the history of the collection. So it was neat to find this collection that was very, very latent in any of the existing metadata. And then the second 2 rows are bikes, and so you see these bikes. Some of them are actually people using bikes to get around military installations. The one on the 3rd row in the middle, and then some of them are children playing. Then there's a kind of a great one on the bottom row in the left column of bikes like left against a school where the kids are in school. So it's kind of interesting that in that case the bikes are really signifying the absence of the children. And so it's just a great way of seeing these themes that you would never have thought to find in the collection, and very few of these include the word cake or the word bike. And so using this algorithm, not that we were going specifically to look for bikes and cakes, but that it detected these objects and then found these connections was really interesting.
And then you can also see things like car, truck, train. So, you know, to me that if you go back and look at the collection too, there's a lot of rethinking about the collection, as well as a lot about like mobility and transit as well becomes like another lens into it as well. So opening up some thematics and themes in this collection that, you know, help us see sort of the Cutodian everyday life of life in the US.
And there are certainly some errors because you can see laptop on there.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, most of
may
the
I ask
time.
a question?
Yeah.
So that is, these are the 80 MS COCO categories, right? So which are trained on modern data, and in some sense, machine learning computer vision specialists have arbitrarily decided that this is sort of the challenge they want to go for.
Yeah.
So obviously they look for buses and laptops and stuff like that. You're in a sense lucky, you know, there is no Renaissance painting except for maybe some paintings by St. Anthony where you will find a credible donut. While in your pictures, donuts are a thing for obvious reasons. But that is probably something which will, I could assume like people who review your book would basically mention, oh, you know, it's like everybody in computer vision knows that this is a almost ridiculously small subset of things. And then the whole thing of transfer learning comes in, of like, how can we translate to actually find stuff that is interesting for us, quote unquote, whoever us is. And so have you thought about that? Like what is the restriction of what you're like? I would assume there's a baseball glove, and like now all the ice hockey fans will be sad that early ice hockey is not covered, even though there may be pictures.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. It's one of the reasons that we have largely focused on the stuff categories, because they are much more generic. Things like sky, plants, ground, gravel,
Grass.
building, grass, and so we really like those a lot because they were built in this hierarchical fashion. They were designed to try to find virtually everything you could have in the background of an image in this very generic sense. Because we know the problem with this this set here is, as you said, very, very arbitrary. By applying that algorithm, you kind of get these for free. They come out of it, and so we thought it was interesting to look at them, and we did find some interesting patterns. And yeah, you're right. With transfer learning, if you know what you're looking for, you at least have some idea. You could pre-train it. But we really liked working with the stuff categories because we find that they're great and they don't really restrict you the same way. And the hierarchical nature of it means that at least at some level of the hierarchy, well, we mostly work with photography. But if you were to apply it to even paintings, as long as it works, I think the categories would be appropriate, like sky, ground.
Yeah. Sometimes we find like it gets the same thing wrong all the time. And then you can like just map it onto a different concept. Like it always, I'm trying to
Laptop's always a typewriter.
Yeah, laptop's always a typewriter. So there's like funny like technologies like remnants in there, like, I don't know, it's kind of ghostly, like like the technologies of past being tagged by the contemporary technology, which I find that's a side note, but I just find that to be an interesting, like the way they're built, something about the way they're built. Does that. So yeah, we tend to, I mean, that's why I really like the stuff category. It's just the abstractness of it that's not specific to the objects and how they look at a current moment. Because even a phone has changed a lot in the last 30 years. You know, a cell phone, you know, looks very different than what it did, you know, for those who remember the bigger block ones that you like, or, you know, your ear with an antenna all the way up here, versus, you know, yeah, for those of some of us remember those. So anyway, the old Motorola's with the screw top antenna. So yeah, so this is just, I mean, this is more of a fun, like just like, you know, start, you know, okay, you have a large collection. Can you even begin to understand it? And one of the reasons we play with these as well is we use the FSA as a lot, as just like a baseline for actually when we apply these algorithms to other less described collections. So what's happening is we've worked with the collections that have a lot less metadata than FSA. So what we've been doing is using the FSA as sort of like a test a lot for like, okay, how is this algorithm working? We have a lot of checks on it with it because of some of the metadata and other pieces. And then how well is it doing? And then we can try something else. So anyway, just so some of the kind of like things we just was like thinking about more is that this is that the visual content does kind of broadly map onto the needs of a government of rural life in the land and the shift to depicting a nation at war. But we have some space for the photographers to follow their own interests and develop their own style. And they're not just like disciplined into certain ways of seeing and looking. The themes and topics aren't just sort of limited to bureaucratic expediency. They can kind of focus on daily life and the everyday. So we can kind of get this as a larger vision of this sort of very, this is kind of very highly regarded photography, probably one of the most important photography collections in the US. So we can just sort of start to begin to reframe it and add on to it and in new ways. So I think that one of the more fun things we did with some of this was actually build something called Photogrammer that brought in some of these elements of image similarity and all to sort of to add on to that, which we were talking about communicating results. So we wrote some papers and there's the book, but one of the things we thought about was like public humanities work as well. So what we did was we took some of the findings and we skipped some of the stuff on like mapping and timelines, but we turned it into a public interface for people to explore the collection and to see the other photographers in new ways.
And this is available at photogrammer.org.
So start to censor the images. And one that will probably be the most interesting to this group in a second is what's about to do is it's going to zoom in here in a second on a single photograph, and you'll see these things called similar photos. And so basically what's happening here is this is an image embedding algorithm, and it is looking at which photographs are like it. So it just says which, it's an image embedding algorithm. And one of the things that's neat about this is not only is it kind of starting to give you like topics in the collection, sort of like basically visual topic modeling, it connects photos that have no metadata. So you'll see, for example, a photo that just was there on the left. Let's see if I can go back for a second. Pause it. Oh yeah, this thing's always fickle. Hold on one second. If you look on the bottom, if you see under similar photos, you're gonna see a photo has no description below it. So what it does is this is at the scale of the whole collection now, all 170,000. There are photos that have no metadata, like there's no description, there's no photographer, there's nothing. And so what it allows us to do is to use the image similarity to start to show the photos that have no metadata in the collection, to show them in relationship to the other photos. So you can start to see themes like storefronts, signs, trains. And so even if the photo has no description whatsoever, we can use the annotation and of it being which photo is similar to another and make a recommender system to begin to reveal the photo. So this is one of the things we've been thinking about as we think about scaling up.
And so the reason that there's no metadata for some of them is that all of the captions come from the prints, and not everything was printed. And also the captions were largely written by the photographers themselves. So the language used to describe them are very specific to a photographer. So if you want to find connections between someone looking at potato farming in northern Maine and pea farming in Southern California, you're not going to find them by any of the vocabulary because they're not going to use any of the same terms, even though the visual style of them can actually be very similar. And so using the similar photographs, you can jump across the arbitrary boundaries of the metadata by looking at them visually, which is very cool. And then there are links in the thing if you want to look across the structured metadata as well, and do the search that way. But
yeah, so that's just a little fun thing that we've not fun, a big thing we built. Took a lot of time to also open it up in interesting ways, and we're turning Photogrammer into a generalizable toolkit if folks are interested in that. But you can kind of build your own Photogrammer. But the last thing I think might be the most interesting to y'all, which is our ADDIE project, which is the work we've been doing to sort of generalize some of this work from the library. We've been looking at the different algorithms to see how they perform. And we scaled up to 5 different collections from the Library of Congress of varying levels of description. And we built this interface called ADDIE. And what we're showing you is basically how little of the image computer vision sees and how much does it actually see. And so we're showing you how confident we are in the different algorithms and showing kind of how it works. And this is an exploratory tool. So you have some object detection algorithms, you have some face, and then you have pose, and then the panoptic segmentation is the image segmentation we showed you before the thing stuff.
Yeah. So one of the things that we really like is you can see here is you can turn the opacity of the image on and off, and we like that because you can start with the image. With the full image, and then you're kind of, I feel like when you look at the annotations on top of the image, you're kind of misguided about how well it works and how much it sees. Then when you turn off the actual image and all you're left with are the annotations, you realize how much is maybe missing or how much of a semantic gap there remains between the computer vision's understanding of the image and your own. And that was fortuitous. It came from us playing around with the visualization engine and figuring out how opaque to make the background image. And then Lauren mentioned, hey, it would be cool to change that. And we built a slider, and then it's just been like probably the most interesting thing about the whole tool is the ability to turn it on and off and really think about, this is how I see the image, this is how the computer sees the image, this is how I see the image, this is how the computer sees the image. And this was intentionally just throwing a bunch of computer vision algorithms at these things, just because we didn't actually want to like pick ones that we knew worked on these collections. We wanted to see where they made errors, where they made mistakes, where they worked well. And so that was the point of the interface.
Yeah.
And,
So this is a part of that, like kind of about like, as we're thinking about annotating with computer vision, thinking about what do we see, what don't we see, how's it labeling, and being really careful about that. And then thinking about how this produces descriptions that we can pair with other metadata to do that. So this is just a thing we did for the Library of Congress. So
yeah, we were trying to think like about like, you can see up in the corner, there's archival data. We really wanted to separate the archival metadata from the automatically generated data and make it clear that distinction. And then in the lower right-hand corner, thinking about the user experience, we realized that if you follow the similar photographs, it's really fun to keep clicking on the image. The similar photographs, that people would get stuck and only look at one part of the collection. And so we started actually adding on a set of random recommendations to get out of those loops. And that let people really explore the breadth of the collection instead of like getting stuck in a small subset of it, because these collections are
nice. May I have a question that is actually, if you pause it here where you can see this image. So yeah, thank you very much. So this is like in the scope of what you were talking about at the beginning, where you said, revolutionizing undergrad education, basically. This is a very, very sort of educative way of how to sort of like bring people in to see problems that are with the data. Now, we're in a very interesting transition point where more and more collections have scanned significant amounts of material. This will probably go on for a number of decades because there's so many places that can't afford it and stuff like that. But, there's places that one could say come to fruition, like the Smithsonian, like FAS, like Library of Congress, places like that, where this all becomes possible. But now there is many different ways how to look at these pieces. And let me just give you an example how this comes, like how this struck me to ask this question. When I see this picture, like I saw the annotations, and the annotations were all at the bottom because you were looking at something like that. But the thing that came to my cortex was like, oh my God, this looks like Giuseppe Terrani fascist architecture in Italy. What is this? I've never seen this. And then I looked around in the frame and I see there's like, okay, that's the War Department, and it's built in 1939, which is like, okay, that's like late Terrani. It's like, who in the US in 1939 builds basically an architectural copy of a fascist building? It's crazy. You see what I mean? That is a really interesting thing. And so like that, anybody in this room would have completely different associations about different images. And now this is all not much different than running an algorithm. It's just like the algorithm that is 48 years old, is called Maximilian Schich, and runs around the world and is curious about certain things and trains on the way. But now the key question is, how can we loop that back? Basically, it's like how do we actually sort of make sure that people not only learn like what you're doing here, but how can we actually loop back in that information, which one would imagine would be great to have some kind of like combination of what you're doing, like algorithmic recognition, annotation, while at the same time some kind of maybe Wikidata, Wikipedia style sort of like feedback into the collections, which people have tried, if we're very honest, since like probably 100 years. You know, if you go to the photo collection, people write with pencil on photo cards and stuff like that, but that never works systematically. You have to hire people to do so. And in the same way, one probably has to hire people to do what you do systematically. Like, you can do stuff like this, you can teach it, but then the question is, what would ensure that this is done systematically and actually sort of like makes the collection better, not just can make the collection better?
Yeah, I think that's it's an open question about the partnerships and things. And I mean, in our case with like FSA, that process, I mean, you may have seen it briefly. It was like you could put the strips of photographs back together. We actually told them how we did that at Library of Congress, and they implemented it on their end. So sometimes it's just sending the metadata back to people. But there's not a great, at least at the scale of those institutions, there's not been a great feedback loop into it. I know Library of Congress is thinking about that right now when they're cloud computing and this computing in the cloud initiative. But yeah, Wikipedia would be interesting. Yeah, I don't know if it's a good answer. I think it's an open question actually about the kind of a generous cycle back with the institutions. I'm not, you know, like sort of not, this was not a critique. It's just something that bothers me since forever. Whenever we do these kind of like database things, any genre for institutions, that is sort of like the big question, like how is this sustained, right? It's often like, ironically, we're still in a world where the most old school, most evil way of doing things, like, you know, having a subscription database and paying a librarian to do the work from the subscription is still the most viable thing. So the question is, how can we take this to the 21st century, basically, is a really interesting question. Yeah, I think it's a great question. It's an open one too. Yeah.
Okay, I think I did, like, did I see the last slide or no?
Oh yeah, that's it. We threw a bunch of things at folks to see, you know, kind of give an idea of what we're talking about here, and the distant viewing as a method, but also kind of starting to think about what isn't kind of rolling back to how doesn't it even, what are we viewing in the first place, which comes to your question, right? Like you saw something very different, like you came at it from a different perspective. So even what we go looking for really changes. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. So we're like 1 hour and 24 minutes in. So we have on paper 35 minutes where we can do whatever we want, including finishing early. And Mila, Mar, myself have taken liberty to ask questions in between. I, you know, kindly ask everybody else to sort of like chip in their 50 cents or ask questions, or bring up a discussion, like, you know, things we haven't, or the speakers haven't covered and that need to be put on the table. So anybody wants to start?
Or you can show us.
Yes, Viune.
Hi, and thank you for a very exciting talk that I think relates to a lot of the project, a lot of the work we have been doing here in Estonia at the CUDAN Lab. I was wondering about something that perhaps relates to your tool. And I saw that you, of course, started with images, the photography collection, but then you have moved to working with video. So at least you mentioned working with TV series, for example. In those cases, if I understand correctly, you have summarized the series as a sequence of shots, and then these shots were analyzed. But I'm now wondering if you have considered or perhaps tried to measure something that gets lost when we start seeing films as collections of images. For example, the speed of editing or the rhythm in the movie in which the shots appear. Maybe you have some thoughts about that.
Yeah, shot length.
Yeah. So when we work with moving images, often the first pass is to do a shot detection and then kind of think of the shots as the lowest level of aggregation. But we do usually look at all of the images in them and then take into account like the shot length, like how long is the shot. We can use some measurements like optical flow that show how much movement there is. And then you can even apply that to certain objects. So you can, this is where the interacting the different annotations with one another becomes complex in a, at least for me, really exciting way. You can actually detect the people, use the algorithm we were using today, the thing stuff detector, detect the people, and then apply optical flow on top of it. And then you can figure out how fast the people are moving relative to the rest of the frame. And then relate that to the length of the shot. So even within a shot, it's not reducing the shot down to just a single default frame or some information about it, but you can really start to see the movement within it. Something that we really want to work a lot more with and have only gotten started with is integrating the sound, the sonic space of it as well, which is obviously a very important part of the film. And have the sound information and subtitles for almost all of them. But there's really a much less out of the box algorithms that work great for sound. And there's been a little bit more recently to try to detect is there music, is there spoken word, are there multiple speakers, is there laughter, etc. Things like that. And so we'd really like to integrate the sonic space as well. And perhaps when we have captions, even the textual information about what is being said, so that you get the whole experience of television or film, rather than just reducing it down to like still images. So yeah, those are the different ways.
Just to give an example, we've been working with 1960s TV shows, and one of the things we're starting to see is that when it goes from black and white to color, it speeds up.
Yes.
The shots get much shorter. We don't know entirely why. We have theories, but like why from black and white to color does it like suddenly? I would have actually thought it would have been the other way around, to be honest, because you have so much more visual information. Color, you could use the set in interesting ways too, that you could actually sit longer on something.
Could it be material cost of the films and length, stuff like that?
Well, it doesn't change the overall. It's sitcom, so it doesn't. The show has to be 27 minutes, no matter how you.
Yeah, but the reels you put in the camera may be different size.
It could be a material thing.
Could be.
Yeah, it should be streaming though over a.
One interesting question that is related to this is about 12 years ago or something. I gave a talk at Jacobs University of Bremen, and the University of Bremen had a bunch of people there in the film studies department, which back then they did all the faces, like they recognized all the faces in all episodes of the old Star Trek, the Captain Kirk version. And they also did things like recognition of bicycles, recognition of cars, where, if it drives past, they did this with a slit scan. So you take one rows of pixels and then you just see how they go by. And if it's a diagonal line, the car goes this direction. If it's a diagonal line, it's at a different angle. It is something small, faster or something like that. And so there is a lot of work in that direction. And if you look at even the work in sort of cultural data analytics, if you look at the film work that, Lev-Manowitz and groups like that do, that seems to be disjunct from that kind of work. And that work itself seems to be disjunct of the self-theorizing of people who were like cutters in the 50s and 40s. They totally also knew these kind of ways of like how shots function and stuff. And now we have this other revolution, which is digital humanities, where this is sort of reintroduced again. And so the key question is it the historization of these methods? Do you think this is is this starting over and over again? Or in your book, for example, do you take this into account? Do you do a little deep history of like the methods that you are sort of facilitating, basically?
Yeah. We definitely situate within like cinemetrics and like very salt and 30, 40 years of work in shot detection and, all of that. And then we also try to historicize all the algorithms we use. So like, where does image similarity come from? How did it emerge? Where does image, neural nets come from? So we tried to historicize both the technology and the approach or method along the way, so that yeah, so you have that and try to make it clear where we think we're making, where we might be pushing the method, but also just how it's been around for a while and why it needs to be historicized. That's definitely a part of the equation. So, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I always like to historicize. That's always like, I don't know about y'all, but that's like it's like, wait, is this, it's like face detection's not new. There's a long problematic history of face detection that we're all inculcated in. So, yeah.
Mikael Tom.
Yes, thank you very much for your talk. And it is, of course, extremely, as people before mentioned, extremely relevant to what we have been interested in here and what we have been thinking about here. Actually, I have two questions. One of them is just technical. Basically, I might have missed when you mentioned it, but it looks like what you produced is actually can be thought of as a tool which may be useful to various other researchers working with various other data sets. So the question is how available it is and where we can sort of, how user-friendly it is, how available it is it possible to sort of use your tools for other purposes? And the second, I will finish probably both questions at the same time. The second is more conceptual. Basically, what you said at some point is that it is more interesting and more robust to look at some sort of universal features like ground and sky and something like that, which is not confined to a somewhat arbitrary set of possible objects on the thing. And I wanted to ask, do you know of any more such universal things which can be interesting to look at? For example, like maybe is it possible to study somehow a composition of an image, sort of whether the important, well, sort of central thing is in the center or not, or something, or characteristic size of objects or something like this? Do you have any speculation about that?
Yeah, do you want to talk about the toolkit first?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the toolkit, it's open source, and we can share the link to it. Anybody can download and use it. The current form, though, is the audience really are people who are comfortable with some like scripting programming. It's written in Python, but may not be familiar with how to do machine learning and computer vision. So kind of, someone who's done a little bit of data analysis in Python and R. And so it is a programming library. It's not point and click. And what we're working on, the part that we're in the process of doing would be something that was more, you just download it, you open it up, it looks like iPhotos or, just like any other software you have on your machine, like Google Chrome or something like that. And then that would just be point and click and available to anybody, but that doesn't exist yet. But the Python toolkit, it does. And if you're familiar with Python at all, you can use it as right now.
Yeah. And in terms of like more generalized features, I would say that what we often do is like map concepts onto it. So I don't know if there's like, besides like color, which is one you can always do as well. The more like generalized like sky, ground, those kinds of things. I don't know if there's a lot more in terms of that. We usually just use other elements to then construct composition. So it's like taking faces and then you can calculate the bounding box inside the frame and then map it onto a concept, like as I mentioned before, like portraiture or something like that. I don't know if that, like, you probably could wrap it up as a more generalized algorithm, but I don't know if anyone who's like officially done it that way. We are working on some documentation for the distant viewing toolkit that will have some of that in it. But it's not going to be like, it'd be like, how do you calculate it? Less than like, a generalized algorithm for it. Although I guess one could make a portrait algorithm. I haven't seen one. I've seen shot detection algorithms.
Yeah, shot
Shot pretty well.
But yeah, mostly
faces.
it's like with the application we showed, it's you take the annotations, you try to make them as generalizable as possible. Though, you know, you're always missing something, and then you can work on top of them. And then what's nice there is that it's much easier to iterate. If it's just a question of like, okay, I've detected all the faces, and I'm going to say a portrait is the face has to be this big and this centered. Am I okay with portraits of more than one person? Does it have to be one person? Does it have to be, you know, just framed above the shoulders? Can it be maybe framed above the waist? You can play around with it and change it. And we found that the cutoff that makes sense really depends on the collection.
Pose algorithms are getting very good. So I'm wondering, I think that's going to be a space where there's going to be ability to generalize more. They're not quite there yet, but they're getting there.
Yeah.
Mark Carnett.
Great question. Thank you.
I was in your GitHub in the system viewing, and yeah, it's in Python, and I understand that if you add like a video, it gives you the segmentation, the faces, but for each frame, or you make shock detections in the videos.
So the algorithms are built, other than the ones that are there now, are built to work on an individual frame. Although there's one that does shot detection, and so you give it an entire path to it. Give it the path to a video, and it will read in every single frame and detect the shots. So that one works on the level of the video. Everything else is an individual frame, except that then if you want to apply, say, face detection to the video, you have to write a little loop, but we have a helper function to do it, where you cycle through each individual frame and apply the face detector. So you could decide that this is where the toolkit doesn't decide for you. You could decide that you want to use the shot breaks and take the middle frame from each shot. You could take every third frame. You could take every frame. You could take one every second. You could take the first and last frame of every shot. It's kind of up to you how you want to apply it, because it really is based on an individual image, and we just give the tools so that you can decide which ones you want to do. Yeah. Doing it on every frame is great, but sometimes that can take too long. So
no worries. I have another question if there's no other hands raised. So distant viewing is a term, and the humanities are strong in defining terms, let's put it like that, or keen on defining terms. And just like digital humanities is a term that is deeply intertwined with the Office of the Digital Humanities at the National Endowment of the Humanities. So probably it would exist without it, but it would probably be just one word among many other words like computational humanities, humanities computing, culturomics, cultural data analytics, cultural analysis, cultural science, whatever you want to call it. But it is the thing because that's the funding program. And distant viewing obviously brings to mind distant reading, Franco Moretti, in difference to close reading. Whoever knows Franco Moretti will know that is not sort of politically neutral, maybe. And that brings to mind a whole other story, which is there was this thing called the linguistic turn by Richard Rorty, which supposedly was right. And then the pictorial turn of William T.J. Mitchell came along around 2005. And one of the interesting things is I once had the opportunity about 2005-ish to sit in a room with 15 PhD students and among myself also PhD student and William T.J. Mitchell. And I just frankly asked the question. I was like, you know, Richard Rorty has this thing that he's sort of like, you know, they're sort of labeling him as right wing. Is what you're doing sort of a counter reaction to that? And he very, very, very quickly said, yes, which I found really amazing. And so one of the questions I have is distant viewing is a statement, right? Like there will be a book which will stand in bookshelves, which probably will say these words pretty loud from the bookshelf. What do you think is this in contrast to, and what is it an extension of? Because, you know, we're all the things you have shown, not as nicely, easily done, maybe, but there's precedent. But there is, now you're transported in this new community. And now the key question is like, what is it contrasting to? Like, is there something where you would say, you shouldn't do it like this, you should do it our way, basically? So how would you frame this in a probably, you know, the least conspicuous, but still political way, maybe?
A lot to unpack there.
Sorry.
You know, I think one of the things that we were really interested in was so the book has been a while in the making. And so it does emerge out of an area in digital humanities where a lot of the focus was on text. And then when people were working on images, they were calling it like distant reading images. Mm-hmm. And I think part of what we were interested in is saying, you know, well, there's all of this work, like decades of work on the differences in imagery, images and visual culture and text. And media, there's whole fields like media studies that have, say that the medium changes the message or influences the message as well. And so part of it was like, if we're going to doing computational analysis of the images themselves, we need a different term for it because we need to acknowledge all those things we know from semiotics and media studies and visual culture studies as well. So that was one of the ways that emerges is from that. One of the things we get often is, well, isn't it cultural analytics? It's interesting, cultural analytics. Lev Manovich is very clear that he doesn't mean all of study. He means the study of contemporary digital life. Like he's a new media. His book is like, it's about digital images online, basically. Like
you mean Lev Manovich?
Lev Manovich, yeah. His book is, his book even says like, I know other people use this term more broadly. That is not what I mean, which is like in the intro, which I find so interesting. So like the Journal of Cultural Analytics has this like much more capacious definition than Lev says his work is.
But Lev is not the inventor of cultural data analytics.
No,
and he's also not the Pope of cultural data analytics.
No.
Yeah, right.
No, he's not. But in terms of like someone who's tried to define it, I was just saying we often get the like Lev like version of it. So we sort of see this in like conversation with the cultural analytics, like in conversation with cultural analytics, and then with distant reading. And then I think also what we were really interested in was theorizing how computer vision makes meaning. And so the term came from there as well. So, because there's a literal distance from the eye with the computer doing it. So it's kind of merging all of those elements together. You know, we'll see if the term lasts.
Let me extend the question. So do you get different reactions from art historians and visual studies people, for example?
We get different reactions.
Like to explain this a little bit better, like in visual studies, lots of techniques are, which is sort of like, you know, you could imagine some kind of extension of contemporary anthropology, studying the visual culture. And a lot of methods are sort of reintroduced, you could say, which have been introduced in art history several decades, like half a century to a century before. And now they're sort of like reintroduced for, you know, looking at everyday photographs, for example, like just like you did, which is a really interesting thing. There is this kind of like different times when methods come in different subfields. And then the key question, for example, you have things like I would imagine there's probably, once your book comes out, there will be many courses in undergrad departments in many universities that offer a distant viewing course. And probably more so than Lev Manovich cultural analytics course. Like one of the interesting, I think this is a really interesting thing, because like if you look at what we do in our group, we do not Lev Manovichology, even though Lev is on our board. But what we do is a lot of different things because we call it cultural data analytics, partially because the people who sort of like brought in the money were dreaming of this, but also because it makes sense in terms of a lot of sort of other relationships, because we cannot call it whatever our discipline is called, because there's all this overlap between disciplines. We cannot call it digital humanities because we go beyond both humanities and digital. And so the key question is like, there's a number of functional words that make sense. And it strikes me, for example, that, distant viewing is a thing, that we totally do. It's just like, it makes sense as an astronomer to do Hubble Deep Field, which is a very narrow kind of field in the sky, while at some point you want to open the aperture and you want to look at the whole sky, because you totally need to know like if stars are only in that corner or they're everywhere, for example. And in the same way, this I think can be very valuable. So that is like sort of like how to say, so that's where the question lies. Do you get different reactions from people to whom images are new in essence, because what they do is sort of like study people in the Dust Bowl, and now they also look at photographs, versus people who may say, but we do this since like the 19th century, for example. That's like what I would surmise be a reaction in Europe, for example, right? Like we do image overviews in art history in Europe for much, much longer time than maybe in the US. The US people who have done it have lived in Europe, like Berenson and stuff like that. And so it's quite interesting that this sort of like re-emerges within the sort of discipline sort of like of digital humanities, which is quite funny.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. We've given a lot of we've talked a lot with media studies folks in Europe. And they I think because of the power of like medium is the message basically, or the medium shapes the message at minimum. The desire to have another term other than distant reading has been met quite well. That's been a relatively well received because of the wanting to have a specificity to the medium, right? Saying, we don't read images the same way we read something else, right? And because of the way that distant reading got canonized, got shaped. So there's that piece I think has been a big part of it. Art history, art historians, most people have been pretty, I think art history has the longest tradition of looking, right, and viewing. So I think the terms have changed. I think we've situated a bit in computing. So I think that makes it a little bit different too, that we're really talking about the role of computer vision itself. Like it's about computer vision. So that is a newer than sort of other ways of viewing. So I think that might be the other way that I think art historians have tended to be like, oh, okay, you're really talking about how computer vision does the work, or like how we shape computer vision. And that specificity has helped us get there. I'll say it has been with the conversations with like folks like everyone here, and over the years, and particularly in Europe with art history, that has helped us really refine it. When we first started, we were much broader, and we've narrowed in because of like really great feedback along the way. So yeah, people have been generally receptive, or at least they're saying it. We would love for everyone to have a distant viewing course in their university. What a dream, right? If you have that kind of impact, I'm
not saying I'm teaching one.
Oh, no. I'm just saying that would be amazing. But people have been pretty receptive. Now, when people write their reviews of the book, we might find out who's been sitting. What happened.
So we got a question from Milan, another one from Mar, and we have another 10 minutes to go. So yes, Milan, go ahead.
I just started to think like we have been now I think 15 years in a situation where there is all the time more and more, all these digital visual videos and images are just surrounding us, and the amount is just increasing all the time, as we know. And simultaneously, as you showed today, you have been doing amazing work and opening up, and then there are also other scholars, for instance, in the Netherlands, there are kind of like really interesting. There is really interesting work, coming up. But what is your kind of like take on what would you like to do next, or what is the kind of like is there a certain thing or certain gaps that should be somehow addressed jointly, or kind of like that are still kind of like are there some major gaps that should be addressed, or is everything solved already? Maybe.
Oh my gosh.
No.
No. Oh my goodness. Oh wow. No, I think that one of the things, I'll let Taylor jump in. I think one of the things we've been trying to do is just like open the space up a little bit more for computation, images, and media, particularly thinking of DH. And then I'm always of the philosophy that like it's always exciting. Like the best thing that happens is you make space, and then more people come in, and then like their work is amazing, and you just learn from them and keep going. So that's always my philosophy. Number one, never want to close a space. So I just want to be really, I just think it's no fiefdoms, like just like how do we go further and learn together is like a general philosophy. But I think one of the things we've been really thinking about is Taylor mentioned sound, which is like multimodality. So how do we go from like reading, image, sound, and then like text, and like start to think across these in interesting ways. Multimodality, I think, is a big next step. I think we're getting good theories and methods for text, image, and sound. Now, how do we put them together in the way that the humanities really think, is situated to do and theorize in really interesting ways? So I think we're just embarking on that, which is, I think, super exciting. Yeah. A good moment. So we can collaborate. I'm always like, how do we collaborate? How do we make cool things happen?
Nice. More.
Great question, Mila.
Yeah, actually, I've been looking the code of your tool, and it's really interesting. I already see a suggestion that I can send. I mean, I see that your categories are fixed up. I mean, you should send in the method that to count the categories. Like each one wants different categories, probably. I mean, these categories are kind of like probably a dummy categories, like airplane, bicycle, bird, boat, bottle, bus, car.
I think they're prescribed by the algorithm, right? So
I mean,
yeah,
but and I see that you have this, probably the algorithms will be nice to kind of be able to kind of choose which one you want. But you are right in the beginning that there's so many now different kind of algorithms that appear with AI like every week. That is good that there is some kind of filter, like people had checked that they kind of work well for these kind of purposes. But yeah, I think we can send by email the tool that we're building with Tillman, and because we do pre-processing and then we show the images, but our pre-processing is not the important part for us. Means in terms of like everything what you did, it will be very great to kind of make an example with your pre-processing and our visualization for images.
Complementarity, I think, which is
I think so. Like when you will see, probably you will see it that it is quite complementary. When you have this like range that you show with the confidence, we have a range, but we also have a histogram system, and these kind of things, and you can configure, and it's a tool also. We also have in GitHub already. But we are about to publish the paper, but already we are sending to people that they can check, and it's still work in progress. But I mean, yeah, it's possible to see. But the great work. I mean, I think it's like looks very amazing. I saw that it's only 2 months published, means it's actually pretty new, right? And then question will be how you reach audience and how will be your role for maintaining the tool. This is like something that we also have here, because we start to see kind of like requests from even inside university. Oh, we can use your tool, and then we say, yeah, you can use it, but then sometimes they kind of like think that we will do everything, and then it's like we don't have the time.
Yeah. I mean, that's something we're working on. I think that's what the new grant we just got from Mellon is to try to make the toolkit more easily usable in school settings and high college, and so that we're working on that because it's really hard to reach audience. It's hard to get the word out about them. And we're also developing what are called open educational resources now to go with the toolkit, so that there's more data sets and more like out of the box stuff that people can use. So like if you're a media studies professor or digital humanities and you have a unit on image analysis, you kind of have the materials ready to go to use it. So that will help start spreading the word of the toolkit and getting out. So no, it's a hard challenge. We're still trying to work on that and just got some more grants to try to think of. So if you have ideas, let us know. But I will make a shameless pitch. At the International DH Conference, which will be in Graz, I run the AV and DH workshop, working group or special interest group. And we're going to have a day-long workshop. So I hope members of y'all's team and everyone here can come, or at least a few members can come, because it will be a great way to connect with people. We have a groups all over thinking about audio and visual data. So a great way for us all, it's designed with lightning shorts for everyone to be able to share their tools and what they're building and all of that. So I just want a shameless plug for helping, so we can all keep the connections growing and spread the word about all these great pieces. So yeah, if you it's a constant, anyway, no, I have a great solution, but we're working. If you have ideas, let us know.
Thank you very much.
I think what will be very good, we are also trying to do soon is a video of since it's code, people is afraid, but if you make a video like how to use it, is normally very useful for many people who is not very advanced.
Well, I hope you will send us anything your work, like if you have a paper that comes out, or you're working on toolkits, you'll send it our way. I mean, we love reading it all. And then I don't know, I'm always being asked for like special issues, like people like who does audio visual, who, for things. So if you're working in that space, let me know, let me know exactly what you're doing. And then I'm always happy to like say, have you thought about so-and-so for this or so-and-so for that, like for this special volume or edited issue or whatever. So, or do you know about this toolkit? So I don't know, I'm very much into like, how do we spread the word of all this awesome work we're doing. So, and let us know how we can do that with y'all.
So yes, thank you very much. The ADHO conference happens in Graz, Austria, in the same week that NETSI happens in Vienna, Austria. So whoever wants to do double feature, you can do that, I guess. But you have to decide which sessions to watch where. This is really great. Mar sort of like pitched already what will come out here soon too, and it's really complementary, so this will be really fun. And I think this sort of like, the way to bring it to the right minds and hands to use the tool, I think is a big challenge. And I think it's also quite interesting to look into and maybe look into together, discuss together how this is done. So before we finish this, I would like to do a round of structured thanks, an announcement, and another announcement. So first, thank you, Lauren and Taylor, for giving us this fantastic introduction, which was really, really very inspiring to all of us and interesting to discuss. I would also like to thank our external guests who joined us following the newsletter, following other announcements. I would also like to thank the CUDAN members to actively take part in this, in the discussion. And I personally have to thank Professor Ingo Scholtes and Professor Andreas Rotor here at University of Würzburg for giving me sort of the silent space to run this meeting from. Next week, we will have another Open Lab seminar. It will be a lab encounter with the Urban Complexity Lab at the University of Applied Sciences in Potsdam. For those of you who are already familiar with that, you will know that they are also having, it's not just urban, there's also visualization, there's also large image collection and stuff like that going on. It's a massively collaborative, functioning sort of crowd. And so that will also be super inspiring. So we often oscillate between sort of the monographic lecture teams like we have seen today to sort of like these larger crowds, which is quite interesting. If you want, please follow us on, and I hate to say that, Twitter. We are in the process of also sort of having a presence on Mastodon. There's no CUDAN Lab yet, but there's a Schichtmark, so you can see the same information there. And you can also find our Open Lab seminars, except for a teeny bit. So there's like 1 in 25 who doesn't want to have the recording online, on our YouTube channel, which is by now close to 100 hours of Open Lab seminars. And so this is also something where you can go back. So we built the whole program since fall 2020 in a way that sort of it covers the whole spectrum of things that we think is cultural data analytics, talking about defining that term. And I don't care very much if people know that this term means that or whatever. I don't care about what characters are in there, if it's culture or cultural, if it's analytics or analysis. What I think is important is that we're building a crowd where people are all different, but still sort of like have something to say to each other, and we can learn things that make me at least fundamentally super enthusiastic about learning more.
Yeah.
And we would love to bring together this crowd this year in December. Mid-December, there will be a cultural data analytics conference at Tallinn University, which is quote unquote fully funded in a sense that we can invite all the invited speakers and like there won't be a conference fee probably. But of course, we would like to have plenty of people who attend the conference. There will be a call for paper. All the Open Lab seminar speakers will be invited into the program committee. And I hope everybody says yes. Thank you very much, and see you next week.